So, I recently built a new PC, which meant that I could finally play some games that my old laptop was too slow for. Fortunately, there were some Steam sales going on at the time, and so I picked up two new titles. One of these was Outer Wilds, which, for the uninitiated, is a game about flying around in a spaceship and exploring planets. Seeing as the game is literally about exploration, I figured it would be a good way to branch out from the strategy games and roguelikes that I usually play. I also thought it would be cool to record my gameplay in case anything interesting happened, and so what you're watching is a result. A bit of an analysis of the way that Outer Wilds and video games in general can be scary, as well as some connections with how fear works, or at least how I think it works in the real world, and to some stuff that some smart Greek and Roman philosopher dudes said a long time ago. Before I begin, I should say that this video will include some minor spoilers to Outer Wilds, which is a game best enjoyed blind. So play the game first if you haven't, and if you think you ever will. So, Outer Wilds starts with the following premise. You're an astronaut, and you're part of this cute fictional alien race that's just getting started exploring its own solar system. And hey, your very first launch is today, cool. So I spent like the first 20 or so minutes of the game just running around the planet, interacting with all the other cute alien dudes for some tutorials and exposition, and I eventually got to this chief scientist guy in a museum who gave me these launch codes that I needed to finally get to space. But when I turned around to leave, there's this ancient statue that turned and looked at me, and my character suddenly has this spooky flashback to all the memories that it had seen since I started the game. So, that's kind of weird, but I continued on my merry way anyway. It was only about 20 minutes into my space voyage that I realized the significance of that statue. After launching off my home planet, seeing some cool sights, meeting some fellow space travelers, doing some other stuff, I eventually settled on a nearby planet to rest where I'm suddenly greeted by this white screen and a burning noise. Then I see all my memories replay again, and I'm back to the beginning of the game. So I'm a bit confused at this point. But as I keep playing, it becomes clear what's going on. For whatever reason, the sun of the solar system is set to go supernova about 20 minutes after the game begins, and my character is stuck in this like Groundhog Day death loop. The ancient statue that I saw actually belonged to this precursor civilization, which is somehow linked to the catastrophe, and is also the group responsible for getting me in the loop. So right off the bat, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the sensation of fear. Outer Wilds, whether intentionally or not, does, at least for me, did a great job of making me feel just a little bit uneasy with its introduction. I got so comfortable talking to my alien buddies in the beginning of the game, but that all got snatched away from me when I realized that they'd all die within 20-something minutes of each loop. And if you ever forget about the gravity of the whole death thing, there's these unique strained gasps for air that your character makes every time they wake up, that's just there to remind you. So, that's the setup out of the way, but there's this one specific part of my experience that I really wanted to talk about, where I was exploring these underground tunnels on another planet that had previously been explored by the precursor civilization that I was talking about. And so at this point, as I mentioned, I'm feeling a little bit uneasy, and I reached this big fork into 4 or 5 different tunnels. Each tunnel is marked with a sign. One says, hey, there's a dead end here. One says, hey, we have a shelter this way. But one specific tunnel has this ominous message. And for whatever reason, this scared the absolute crap out of me, to the point that I read the message multiple times and spent probably like 5 minutes deciding what to do, just pacing back and forth in the game before eventually chickening out and going into another tunnel. Thinking back afterward, this experience was kinda interesting to me. Cause what exactly was I scared of anyway? Why did this scene in this game scare me so much more than other games do? So, those are all questions that I thought about and that I'll present my quote-unquote answers to soon. But for now, at the time I decided to take a break from Outer Wilds. Luckily, if you remember, I bought 2 games. So, to chill out and relax a bit, I decided to boot up and take a crack at the other game that I bought. For the uninitiated, Dark Souls is a video game series notorious for its stunning, dark visuals, and its absolutely masochistic difficulty, mostly the second part. I never played a Dark Souls game before, so I decided to give it a go. I consider myself pretty okay at games, so the challenge was kind of attractive. After making my character, I started making my way through the tutorial, and I started to see why this game was supposed to be so hard. Even the first enemies you encounter in the game kind of drop your health bar pretty fast if you're not paying attention. Anyway, as the absolute god gamer that I am, I made my way through without too much trouble, exploring for secrets along the way. Then I found this. So, you can imagine that I was a little thrown off by this, but after a few seconds of indecision, this time I steeled myself and waded my way bravely forward through the tunnel, and then promptly turned back when I saw what was on the other side. But then, as I was walking back, I decided, what am I afraid of? It's just gonna be a tough enemy. But I'm a bit of a god gamer, so it's probably fine, I'll give it a go. And so I turned around, made my way back through to the other side, and readied myself for combat. Then, within a minute, I was super dead. But, did you notice anything different between this experience that I had and the last one? In Outer Wilds, my fear was much stronger, to the point where I didn't even end up going through the tunnel. I chickened out and went through another one. But in Dark Souls, after just brief hesitation, I kind of just threw myself right in. Why was that? What's different? Well, there's probably a whole array of reasons, but I think that a few of them are especially interesting, and one of those differences was Outer Wilds kind of goes out of its way to unbalance the player. From the jarring transition between the peaceful vibes of the opening to the shock of your first death, to the way that the controls for spaceflight and spacewalking and even jumping vary from typical video game controls, the game sets up this situation where the player doesn't really have any clue what they're going to discover or how the rest of the game is going to play out. Compare this to Dark Souls. Sure, if I was playing blind, I might be a little disoriented by the difficulty, but because of the game's reputation, I knew that I was going into what was essentially going to be an action RPG. This is kind of clear from the first moments of my game. I spent like 3 minutes exploring the area that you spawn, turning around and like trying to go backward to see if there were any secrets, because I knew that those kinds of secrets exist in games like these. Then, when I eventually went and fought the Crystal Lizard at the end of the tunnel, you can see that I'm not exactly unconfident. I started strafing around the enemy and rolling when I saw attacks, because I know that's how other games work. Sure, I pressed the wrong buttons on the controller a bunch of times, and I totally got screwed, and then I came back and did the same thing about 10 times, but the little fear that I had from seeing that sign quickly got replaced with focus on the task at hand. Why is that? I think it's exactly because in Dark Souls, I knew what I was getting myself into at the outset, while with Outer Wilds I didn't. In real life, I feel like things are kind of similar. People are willing to do things that are inherently risky, like driving or skiing, or trying not to embarrass themselves in social situations, because we have a reasonable idea of what we're going to see when we try to do those things, and what to do given what we see in those situations. But when we don't have this familiarity to draw on, our minds don't know what the worst case scenario is, nor what to do if things go wrong. And so, consciously or not, we manufacture these fears that are way worse than those that exist. This idea that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself is pretty common, both in pop culture today and throughout history. The quote itself comes from the inaugural address of Franklin D. Roosevelt, which he makes to outline his plan to tackle the Great Depression. The full sentence is as follows.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
The implication here is that sometimes when we're afraid of something, whether it's a final exam or a walk downstairs in the dark, or waiting apprehensively for someone to text you back, we often don't actually have a specific thing that we're afraid of. Rather, the problem often is that we don't know what lies ahead, so some biological response causes us to freeze up and imagine this shapeless, chthonic fear that's way worse than anything that could actually happen. A group of ancient Greek philosophers named the Stoics observed this and addressed it by doing something called negative visualization, or also called the premeditation of evil. They would vividly imagine the worst things that could happen to them and what they would do in those situations. And the idea was that by giving shape to their fears, they would kind of demystify them and prepare their minds for the eventuality or possibility that these fears would be realized. One person who took this to a logical extreme was Cato the Younger, who was a politician in the Roman Republic known for his opposition to Julius Caesar. Despite being really well-to-do, he spent significant portions of his life in poverty by choice, and on top of that, he would also purposely let people make fun of him, because he believed that once he knew everything there was to know about these supposedly scary things, they wouldn't be scary anymore. Cato the Younger wasn't the only big name to have used these techniques, though. Another one of the most prominent ancient Stoics and user of negative visualization was Marcus Aurelius, who was also Emperor of Rome. And a similar technique was even advocated in Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield's book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. And in the book, he affectionately referred to this technique as imagining the next thing that could kill you. This negative visualization stuff is great, and I feel like it strikes pretty well at a lot of what fear is about. If I used it while I was deciding whether or not to go through that tunnel from Outer Wilds, I would have realized that literally nothing bad could actually happen to me if I did go through the tunnel. This is a video game after all. Literally the worst thing that could have happened is a jump scare. There's more to the story though. I don't think any of us can expect to get rid of fear entirely, just because we know rationally that the worst case isn't so bad, especially because sometimes in real life the worst case is bad. And so to expand on that, another important reason I think I felt scared in Outer Wilds is previously, I mentioned that I felt like the controls in Outer Wilds were a little foreign and clunky. This isn't really a surprise or even a knock on the developers. It's not like it's an extremely mechanics-driven game that needs to have tighter responsive controls to work, and the act of piloting a spaceship with momentum is really essential to the game, but by nature, to a first-time player, they're going to be unintuitive. I alluded to the fact that these clunky controls make the player feel like they don't really know what to expect out of the game. But more importantly, I feel like it makes the player feel like they have less control over what happens. Let's say that I did go through that tunnel, and a scary enemy was on the other side. I don't really know how I would have dealt with that. Would I be able to fight them off? Would I be able to escape? I honestly have no clue. By contrast, in Dark Souls 3, when I fought the Crystal Lizard, I knew exactly what to do. I knew for a fact that it would be possible to beat it, because that's the kind of game that Dark Souls is. And that very fact, that fact that I had control over what would happen, stripped away a lot of my fear. If I died, it was my fault. Compare this to real life, and a lot of things make sense. People are disproportionately afraid of flying in planes, when they're statistically the safest form of travel per kilometer by far. And the exact reason for that is that people feel like they have no agency in planes. This relates a lot to the work of another Stoic philosopher named Epictetus. If that name feels like a hard name to know the pronunciation of, you're totally right, because it took like 5 takes trying to remember it. If anyone is an expert of things outside their control, though, it's this guy, because he was born a slave. As a Stoic, Epictetus was concerned with figuring out how one could achieve something called eudaimonia, which is a fancy word for happiness. So, first of all, if there's any takeaway from this philosophy ramble part of the video, it should be that philosophy is really about not like nerd, hand-wavy magic, but just about figuring out answers to simple questions that we all have. Anyway, Epictetus' path to happiness went as such. He first differentiated between things that we as individuals have power over and things that we don't. He then says that we ought to only concern ourselves with things that we have power over, as if we can't control something, it shouldn't really factor into any of our calculations. Then he argues that most things, stuff like our health, our possessions, and our social standing, are not actually in our control because they're largely influenced by outside forces. For example, my sick gaming PC isn't in my control, because any second my roommates could decide that they've had enough of me playing Metal Gear Solid 5 at 2 a.m. and unplug it. To Epictetus, the only things that we can really control, and indeed the only things that should matter to our happiness, are our own thoughts, opinions, and reasonings on things. And I think the best way to explain what he thought about the subject is to read to you this passage that one of his students wrote and ascribed to him. It goes like this. We will not be troubled at any loss, but will say to ourselves on such an occasion, I have lost nothing that belongs to me. It was not something of mine that was torn from me, but something that was not in my power has left me. Nothing beyond the use of our opinion is properly ours. Every possession rests on opinion. What is to cry and to weep? An opinion. What is misfortune, or a quarrel, or a complaint? All these things are opinions. Opinions founded on the delusion that what is not subject to our own choice can be either good or evil, which it cannot. By rejecting these opinions and seeking good and evil in the power of choice alone, we may confidently achieve peace of mind in every condition of life. To be fair, I think Epictetus is asking a lot from us here, saying that you shouldn't feel bad if a loved one passed away, or if you unfairly get fired from your job just because you technically never had a right to those things in the first place, is pretty unreasonable if you ask me. But I think a useful takeaway from what he's saying is that to be happy, we should focus our efforts on bettering ourselves in the ways that we can control, rather than focusing on outcomes which we can't control. I kind of took this rant in a direction that's pretty far from the whole not having control over my Outer Wilds character thing, and to be honest, I'm having a bit of a hard time linking it back now. Maybe I could have just accepted that my alien was probably going to die if I went down that tunnel and reconciled with the uncertainty. I'm not sure. So, before we get too abstract, I want to talk about one more big connection I feel with fear in relation to video games, one that's a bit more human. This isn't really about Outer Wilds or Dark Souls anymore. I think it's more about video games in general, or maybe even just me in general. And that connection is I haven't actually finished Outer Wilds yet, or Dark Souls 3. In fact, I've barely touched them since beginning to write this video. And I think a reason for that, in addition to the reasons that I've already mentioned, has to do with the fact that in both games, I'm just constantly dying. Whether it's from ridiculously hard enemies in Dark Souls, or insta-kill mechanics in Outer Wilds. You may wonder, how come I'm okay with dying in games like Super Meat Boy and roguelikes like Enter the Gungeon, but not in Dark Souls or Outer Wilds? To tell you the truth, I don't really know completely. All I know is that I've struggled with an extra sense of fear that has stopped me from enjoying certain games. In fact, now that I think about it, those games do tend to be exploration-focused games like Skyrim, Fallout, and Legend of Grimrock, where you're making sense of an unfamiliar and scary world, where I don't know what to expect, and I don't feel comfortable in the control of my character. And they tend not to be strategy games like XCOM and Fire Emblem, where I have ample experience and time to figure out the ropes, or roguelikes like Enter the Gungeon, like I mentioned before, where dying is expected from the start, and just part of the fun. So, I guess what I'm saying is that despite having waxed stoic rhetoric about how we ought to not be scared about a lot of things, I still feel scared about those things for reasons that I know are irrational, and that fear is still paralyzing me in some ways. This is true not just in video games, but with life in general. In fact, I procrastinated finishing this video for a long time because, subconsciously or consciously, I was a bit scared about whether people would like it or not, and I was uncomfortable in the experience of trying to make a YouTube video because it's not something that I'm familiar with. I think that no matter what we'd like to think, the truth is that it's normal to be afraid, whether it's rational or not, because humans are not and have never been rational. But to grow as a person and to live life to the fullest, one must seek out situations in which they're uncomfortable and work through them. This saying that goes something like, the master has failed a lot more times than the amateur has ever tried, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So, in video games and life, I'm going to try my very best to put myself in as many uncomfortable situations as possible, and fail as much as I need to before I succeed. Because while death in a video game may be temporary, death in real life is permanent, and so life is too short to waste on being scared. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. If you've watched until now, I can't tell you how much it means to me that people are watching my silly video on games and philosophy. If you have any thoughts or feedback on the video, I'd love to hear it in the comments, and if you enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe and stick around. I made this channel because despite trying to sound super motivational this whole time, I'm really a pretty lazy person, and I'm using this as a bit of extra incentive to pursue and express some of my hobbies, hence the name Hobby Sloth. So, you can expect to see videos about lots of random stuff. I'll definitely do more videos on games and philosophy if people like this one, but I might also do some videos on engineering projects, which is another one of my occupations at the moment. Anyway, that's all for today. Wishing you guys all the best.